Hello and welcome back to the How We Really Feel podcast. This is one of my solo reflective episodes. I'm your host, Dr Sula Windgassen, and I'm going to be reflecting on the episode that we've just had, which was with Steve Kerley and Niall McCann. This was one of the most uplifting, inspiring episodes. It was incredible. So I'm very excited to get into our reflections. Niall and Steve both have experienced spinal cord injuries. Steve experienced his when he was a teenager, which left him a quadriplegic, and he has limited dexterity and uses a chair. He now mentors other people who are navigating life in a new body after accidents like he had. Steve is such an incredibly inspiring person, and he is so open and honest and generous with his time. Niall was an incredible guest. He also experienced a spinal cord injury in a paragliding accident, which he talks about in the podcast. And the two of them had so much concordance in what they were saying, and yet they were such different people, which I thought was a really interesting dimension to the episode. They had very different reactions to when they first had their accident, and they had different journeys in navigating it. And I think that was what was really beautiful about this episode, that reflection of the differences, but also how they came to identify the same things that were truly important to them to get to where they are now, which is enjoying life, making the most out of it, and leading lives full of meaning and purpose, and spreading the benefit of their lives to those around them, and having such an incredible impact on the world. So perhaps I'll start from that common sentiment that I hear come up a lot, especially amongst able-bodied individuals, where they hear of something terrible happening to somebody health-wise, injury-wise, and they say, gosh, if that happened to me, I couldn't cope. I wouldn't want to deal with that at all. It wouldn't be possible. And I guess that's very natural for us all to assume. But the reality is there's so many people every single day that find themselves suddenly or gradually having to navigate something that they never thought that they'd have to. And it's really important, I suppose, to recognize that automatic assumption of I couldn't do that, and where that comes from. Often it comes from all sorts of other assumptions underlying that. So what I'm really excited to reflect on from this episode is just the degree of resilience, tenacity, adaptability that we actually have when we do go through huge adversity and life changes. And Steve and Niall are such good examples of that. And there was so much that they brought out from this conversation. I don't really know where to start because there was so much in this. I suppose I'll start with the fact that at the very beginning of the episode, I asked both of them to talk a little bit about their experiences that led them to their injuries and how that happened for them and how they experienced that. And I shared a model of adjustment that's often used in the health psychology literature and research, and it talks about how one goes from crisis to coping to then adjustment, and how that's not necessarily linear. You can go back and forwards between crisis and coping before you reach adjustment. And sometimes when you're in adjustment, something might knock you back to coping. And I was very surprised to hear Niall's experience of that, where he was telling me he felt like he just moved through those 3 stages instantly when he realized he was still alive after his crash, because he thought that he wasn't going to make it. And in contrast, Steve's experience was very different. He felt like he stayed in that crisis mode for such a long time, and there was a big interplay between this crisis and coping, and things would knock him back into crisis. And I suppose to me this reflects just how different we all are, and our brains like to make dichotomies of better, worse, good, bad, helpful, unhelpful. But the reality is there's so many different shades, and we only have so much control about what our experience is. Just because we struggle with something at the outset or something takes us a bit longer doesn't mean it's going to continue to stay in that phase or in that mode. There's lots of scope for things changing, and we learn from every iteration. Every time we move back from coping into crisis and crisis back into coping, that can help shift us towards adjustment in the long term. And that can be really hard to have that perspective when you're in the journey, when you're back and forwards between those two places when you're dealing with all of the mood disturbances that might come with that, all of the physical difficulties. But I think just even having some kind of perspective and awareness that this doesn't mean you're never going to get to where you want to be, you're never going to be able to adjust, you're never going to be able to improve things, is super important. And the conversation that Niall and Steve and I had, I think really, hopefully, will emphasize that to you and bring you lots of hope. Both Niall and Steve talked about the importance of that internal dialogue and that internal mindset. Steve, at the outset of his journey, was very much resistant to what was happening, and he was very young. He had an idea of how his life was going to be, which was very different to now what his physical reality was going to be. And he reflected how stuck that made him for a long time, how that precluded him from being able to work with his body and improve and recover, because he was trapped in this place, quite understandably so. When we explored the role of that internal narrative and mindset with Niall also, what he identified very keenly and clearly was something really shifted for him when he moved from this internal tone that was something like, don't be weak, don't cry, to being something that was genuinely encouraging and ultimately compassionate. How much things opened up for him. And I think I reflected with them both, and this is something that I reflect on in clinic a lot. We often think that that tough love mindset, that critical harshness gives us an edge, keeps us motivated, pushes us forward. But actually a lot of the research would suggest that when we have that kind of tone, but it's very critical and harsh and uncompassionate, it actually has the opposite effect. It's inhibiting, it holds us back, it makes us procrastinate, it increases the threat of not doing things in a way that we think that we ought to be doing things. And that creates more emotional disequilibrium, that makes things harder for us. It can then, have physiological effects as well, where we feel like we physically can't do things. And so it really isn't something that serves us, but there's so much that we've absorbed in our kind of society and societal messaging that makes it hard for us to move away from that belief. That inner critic serves me well and I need to keep harsh with myself. And even once we start discovering that the critic isn't so helpful for us, that it's not serving us in that way, it's a brain habit, right? Our brain has gotten used to processing cognitively in that way. And now we're trying to ask it to process information in a different way. That involves the generation of new pathways, if we think about it like that, new brain habits, which we can pave. This concept of neuroplasticity, we can change our brain, we can change how it works, we can update the modeling and the network activity. But it takes time. So don't beat yourself up for defaulting back to critical. But I think it's really, really important to know that we can change that. But first of all, it's fundamental that we see that there's a benefit to doing so. And I think at the point where Niall was reflecting on recognizing just how much shifted for him when he went from telling himself not to cry and that he was being weak to allowing himself his experience, that really, really resonated for me, especially coming from a man. Men are socialized to be stoic, to not show emotionality, to perpetuate these kinds of attitudes I've just talked about. So it is so beautiful to hear a man break away from that pattern, recognize it and say it with such clarity. And I think we need more of that broadly in our society. We need more of this conversation. The other thing about this was Niall felt that he didn't consciously engineer that shift in his internal monologue. Actually, he concluded that it seemed to happen as a natural shift when he stopped trying to fight his body. And this also related to something that Steve was saying. He was very angry with his body to begin with, and he, was impatient, and he felt it was the enemy and it was holding him back. And where he got to and what he reflected on being really important was actually working with his body where it was at, giving it time to adjust, facilitating that adjustment with patience, with gentleness, with experimentation, not being quick to be disappointed or frustrated, which is obviously very difficult when your body's not working how you would want it to. But both Niall and Steve talked about that shift in the way they saw their bodies, the way they treated it, and the way that that kind of filtered back into and was impacted by their internal narrative and mental dialogue. And this again really reflects what I see in practice all of the time. Our relationships with our body can be very adversarial, can make us feel like we just don't want to know them. They're really being mean to us and we don't want anything to do with them. And so then we can have all these ways of breaking up with our bodies or trying to strong arm them. But actually that only ends up feeding into this internal frustration with ourselves, with our sense of self, because our body is an extension of ourself. And so it perpetuates a real problem for us. When we start to shift things, how we're treating our body, how we're speaking to it, we also potentially shift how we're speaking to ourselves and treating ourselves. And whichever way we start, if that's with our internal narrative or dialogue with ourselves, whether that's with how we're starting to treat our body rather than like forcing it to do something, gently doing it rather than trying to rush all the time, slowing down, whatever it might be, the two start to feed each other and we can move to a place that's more compassionate, more realistic and more respecting of where we are physiologically. And from there, as Niall and Steve both reflected, things can really shift and change. We talked in this episode a bit about that adjustment process and how it can be very hard, it can be very scary to try and do things when your body's working differently, and how that could naturally make you want to withdraw or feel like you can't try doing things in this new way, in this new reality. From the beginning, you don't know how to do it feels scary, you don't want to do it, naturally you might withdraw. And I was asking them a bit about how do you start to build that confidence? And Steve, again, was sharing how this has to do with being patient with yourself. You don't have to be confident from the outset. You don't have to do everything from the outset. But he reflected that confidence builds on itself. So as you manage to do one little thing, and you manage to do that repeatedly, and then you manage to do that slightly differently, that starts to generate some more confidence and opens up something else slightly different. And as you start to do that, that builds on itself, opens up more avenues, and so on. So we can be impatient to be 5, 10, 30, 100 steps down the line from where we are. But if we just focus on cultivating a bit of confidence to work with where we are at now, at this point, in a slightly different way, in a way that might feel exposing, it might feel like we're going to get some judgment, that will start to help us move on where we are to where we want to be down the line. Naturally, building that confidence does come with some discomfort. It comes with the fear of the unknown, the uncertainty, the expectation perhaps of judgment, maybe actual judgment. And so we have to be patient with ourselves with that experience too. We have to make sure that we're resourced to deal with some of that. And we have to pitch it to where we're at, what our capacity is. So if we have such limited capacity, there's no point doing something that if it goes terribly wrong or if it's terribly upsetting, it will set us back from trying anything out again. That's not going to be conducive or helpful for us. But if we can try something that's like, if that is uncomfortable, if it doesn't go well, I can still just about handle it and learn from it and then try again, something else. That's where we really want to pitch it to begin with. I reflected a bit on this threat-gain equation where at the outset, the perceived threat may be much bigger than the perceived gain. But as you do start to make little steps, that equation starts to shift. The threat reduces and the gain increases. And the more the perceived gain increases, the more naturally you're going to become more curious and explore more things. And the more your world can potentially become bigger. Related to this sense of experimenting with doing things differently, with being confronted with things that might be difficult, both Steve and Niall talked about the realities of the more hidden aspects of your body changing visibly. in terms of continence, in terms of changed sex life, in terms of, Niall gave an example of being on stage, thousands of people, and not having anal sphincter muscle control because of his spinal cord injury and farting on stage. And happily for him, he got a round of applause. And so there was something really beautiful in just normalizing the things that can change with your body as you experience injury or illness, and how naturally you might feel shame or embarrassment or feel that that means that you need to hide something, but that there's such power and such opportunity in challenging some of those perceptions and finding, of course, safe spaces to help you challenge those perceptions of the experience that you're having, so that it feels safe to be in your reality and you still feel accepted to be in your reality. What was really lovely was that both Steve and Niall talk so openly about these elements to really help destigmatize the conversations around continence, the realities of having to catheterize, the realities of a changed sex life. Both Niall and Steve talked about the shift in having to think more about their partner's pleasure rather than their own because of their own injuries and not having that same sensory experience. And there was a pragmatism and a kind of broader awareness that was really resounding when they were reflected on these things, which I think you have to listen to the episode to really feel. But it was incredibly empowering and inspiring, and it naturally seemed to contextualize a lot of these things that we might worry about not being able to cope with, what kind of repercussions might come with them, that they are copable with potentially as we allow ourselves to adjust, to explore, to make new ways around our life. And they did such a wonderful job of sharing, what that's looked like for them. And lastly, very much related to those points, both of them were very clear about how important social connection is when you're dealing with a body that works differently. And, more broadly speaking, we all really, really need social connection and social safety, but how fundamental that is when you're navigating these health journeys, when you're navigating recovery, when you're navigating symptoms that are unpredictable, and that you don't have full control over. Both Niall and Steve talked in depth about the power of that social connection. It's one of the reasons why Steve is now a mentor to people who have experienced accidents and are now adjusting to a new physical reality. And he talks about how much that makes such a difference for people, because they can see, okay, where I am now is not necessarily where I'm going to be. And they've got someone that they can feel understood by, feel seen by, and also learn from and get support from. And I think that's, again, something that we don't recognize enough just broadly in general society. It's not something that's plugged into our healthcare systems. It's not something that we are given the opportunity to really nurture that well. But it's so fundamental when you are impacted by these things, and often when you're experiencing additional social isolation because of these things. And Niall was talking about how friendships can change and how people might not know how to act around you if your realities change, and how that can be difficult, but how he took such comfort in his friend just acting normal, still taking the piss out of him, and how welcome that was, and how that made him feel so comfortable and accepted and part of the friendship still. And I think that was a really lovely part of the episode that hopefully will resonate for people who are listening, because they want to support others and, look after others and show up in ways for their friends, for their loved ones, perhaps just for, general people out and about who you might encounter. It isn't about being perfect and saying the right thing all of the time and changing into a fundamentally different person or role yourself. It is about making your friend feel valued and belong in your friendship group and connected with you and seen by you. And there is so much to be said for just general friendship maintenance, asking how they're feeling, checking in, making jokes with them, sharing things that you think would be interested. A recurrent theme in my clinic with people that I see with chronic illnesses is that people feel like they become so isolated because they can't participate in life as usual. People kind of opt out of checking in on them or asking if they want to go out or do certain things, and then they become completely invisible and it feels like they're disposable. So there are just little things that we can do when we have friends, when we have people in our lives that have bodies that work differently, to make sure that they're still included, they're still thought of, they're still very much humanized as people with needs, with personalities, with wants, with interests and curiosities, and just continue to treat them as such, ideally. And I suppose the last point, related but slightly different, was that both Niall and Steve recognized that when you're experiencing something health-wise, when your body changes, it also has an impact on the people around you. And that impact shouldn't be minimized or overlooked either, because it's a hard one. They are trying to do their best, hopefully, for you, to be supportive for you, to find out how they can navigate the new reality, any practical things that might have changed, whilst also, being impacted by these changes themselves and having to emotionally adjust and process. And that's a difficult position to be in. So what I really loved about what both Niall and Steve said was there is license to respond imperfectly, to do things imperfectly on both sides, the person that's impacted directly by health issues and those supporting them. But the most important thing is being compassionate, wanting to show up for each other, hearing each other, endeavouring to do what's right and helpful for each other, and seeing that both people exist in a relationship, whether that's a romantic relationship, parent and child, siblings, friends, etc. And I think there's real wisdom in that, because it's very natural and kind of a physiological automation for our brain to become really internally self-focused, which isn't the same thing as selfish, when we're going through adversity. Really like a threat response. Our brain's just trying to figure out, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? And so naturally, what's going on for the people around us can get filtered out as we're engaging with this. And certainly that's something that I experienced when I was in the depth of all of my bladder issues. It just felt like what was happening around me didn't matter, because I was so overwhelmed with my own experience. But that obviously adds to the disconnection, and that can create difficulties in people being able to reach you and you feeling connected with other people. So this is an invitation to reflect, to see, to what degree are you able to transcend yourself, to look outside of yourself when suffering, specifically with symptoms or, the emotional impact of symptoms, the disruption of symptoms. But beyond that, in the times when that's not quite so present, do we flip our thinking and our awareness outside of ourselves to the people around us too? And what work do we put into the maintenance of relationships, as much as hopefully people are putting into the maintenance of relationships with us? And of course, there can be inequalities, and those inequalities deserve reflecting on and addressing to what degree you can, because as Niall and Steve both identified, that social connection piece is really important when navigating these health issues and looking for pathways to recover and heal and adapt. So there were so many things in this episode. I could keep talking about it. If you haven't listened, please do go listen. It was an incredible episode. You can find the link in the show notes. If there are any resources that you might like to help you with some of the things that I've discussed today, please do take a look at the How We Really Feel podcast website. We have lots of resources listed and linked under each episode. For now, take care.
Learned something today? Your brain hasn't finished with it yet. Research shows revisiting new information is all it takes for your brain to start connecting the dots on its own. So subscribe, listen again, and let it do its thing. Thanks again to our partners at Convatec Continence Care. Don't forget to check out the resources and references linked in the show notes. If you found this episode helpful, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast. It really helps to connect the podcast with those who will benefit most from it. This podcast